Let me ask you then, Douglas, who would most people choose to reassemble themselves as?
Well, I think that most people, after you blew them up with dynamite, would reassemble themselves so that they look like everyone else around them. That's where I think our specieshood asserts itself, like the birds we were talking about at the beginning. I think this need to resemble everybody else is why we shop at, say, the Gap or at Benetton, so that we can be animals in a way. It's our way of reverting to our specieshood.
Your point being?
Well, you never hear an animal saying, like, hey, I think I'm going to move to San Diego and change the color of my fur and lose 20 pounds and change my identity. I think human beings are the only animal that think they can change who they are simply by moving to a different place. I mean, birds migrate, but it's not quite the same thing.
But you were talking about shopping for identity.
Well, yeah, part of not having a life means you have a screwed up sense of time, but it also means you have a screwed up sense of place as well.
Place?
Yeah, place ties into shopping and, say, the Gap. I mean, you've got this kid, lives in Armpit, Nebraska, and he goes out to the local Gap franchise. And in his head, he's got pictures of the Concord, Manhattan, and Claudia Schiffer. And then, so in his head, he's living in Manhattan. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, you've got this other kid who's going to the Gap franchise, and in his head, he's got pictures of Armpit, Nebraska. So in both their heads, they're living everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
So in a sense, Douglas, what you're saying is that our sense of ourselves no longer comes from within, but is influenced by all these things outside of us. The Gap, McDonald's, supermodels.
Yeah, I think many people mistake the current deluge of information diversity as being the end of history, but in a way, I think it's actually the beginning of history.
We've been talking about how minds have changed in the late 20th century. What about bodies? How has our relationship with our bodies changed?
Well, I'm thinking about last week. I was looking at these photographs from the 1950s, and in them everyone was trying to look exactly 35 years old. I mean, you had these 18-year-old boys and girls and these 58-year-old men and women, and everyone was trying to look 35 years old. So that was the age you were supposed to be inside your head back then, is 35. And now what's happened, I think, is that the mental age everyone's trying to be inside their head is about 24, and that's an 11-year shift.
But what about on a deeper level?
Well, as we're talking about the late 20th century here, I think we're probably going to remember this period of time as being one in which the relationship between the mind and the body was completely severed.
Could you give us an example?
I'm fascinated by people with extreme mind-body relationships, people like bodybuilders or models or anorexics, people for whom the relationship is like the Earth and the Moon. There is obviously a relationship, but there's never a true connection at any point. I remember I once read about Karen Carpenter, how she felt as though the entire world existed on the other side of 10 feet of plexiglass. And I think in a way that defines the current mind-body relationship.
How does the modern separation occur?
Well, I mean, maybe you're abused as a child, or maybe you're simply lonely. The fact is, a separation does occur, and then suddenly you become this thing that is you, but not you at the same time. "200 years ago, the only people who had mirrors were kings and queens, and people didn't even know what they looked like. And nowadays, gosh, people use their bodies as marketing tools, as resumes. It's a really strange point in history. In a way, people have become their own focus group. I'm just sort of wondering, actually, about our culture's obsession with supermodels and what it means.
What about it?
Well, I wonder if our obsession with supermodels reflects the super separation of the mind and body we now have in the culture.
Okay, some quick questions here. Are you a vegetarian?
I try.
Have you ever done cocaine?
No.
Acid?
No.
Any tattoos or piercings?
Not yet.
Do you go to the gym?
I try.
Have you ever used steroids?
No.
What? What are you thinking about?
Well, it's just that I've always been really skinny, and so 6 years ago I stopped smoking and started going to a Gold's Gym to stop being skinny. And before I began working out, this woman took calipers to my arms and legs and body and measured the ratios of meat to fat to bone to water. And when she was done, she made this horrified facial expression. And I said, well, what's the deal? I mean, and she said, no. And I said, no, tell me. And she said, well, Douglas, you're what's known technically as a thin, fat person. And I was just horrified. I mean, it's the worst thing you can be. It's, you know, you're skinny and what you have isn't even meat.
What?
It's just a thought that came to mind of how when archaeologists of the future dig up the ruins of California, they're going to find all these fitness centers and all these weightlifting equipment devices, and they're just going to assume that we were a culture completely obsessed with torture.
So when people do all of these late 20th century things to their bodies, like mega dieting, plastic surgery, boob jobs, steroids, what is it that they're really looking for?
Well, my guess is that they want to participate in realms in which they're not going to be held responsible for, which is to say, oh, it wasn't me, officer, it was my body that did it. I mean, say you're a guy and you have pectoral muscles like Fabio. I mean, they're like beef throw cushions. You can throw all the responsibility away from yourself and your actions onto the throw cushions. And I suppose it's the same for women, too.
What about disease? It's such a big part of bodies in the late 20th century.
Well, I think what's happened is people have begun viewing their bodies as being fortresses or inviolable, made out of that same sort of hard, shiny plastic as Lego. But the funny thing here is that the average human body contains 10 times as many alien cells as it actually contains cells of itself. So instead of Lego, the average human body is more like Pigpen from Charlie Brown. Remember the way he used to walk down the street in that sort of perpetual haze of dust and germs? Well, you know, that's people. Actually, we're already so ridden with disease and other organisms that the whole notion of being a fortress becomes somewhat beside the point. Actually, now that I think about it, Pigpen is doing TV commercials for vacuum cleaners right now. So I guess he's got a good agent.